All right, thank you for the introduction. What I want to really do in the next 20 minutes is tell you briefly about an old research project, to unashamedly advertise a new one, and then tell you a story about what I think has happened in between the two of them. The story starts somewhere else in the UK. The story starts in Macclesfield in Cheshire. For those of you who don't know it, Macclesfield is a town of about 50,000 people. It sits about 20 miles south of Manchester, where the Cheshire Plain meets the Peak District. It's not without its pockets of deprivation and social problems, but it's a relatively desirable place to live. When newspapers and estate agents do those kind of surveys of best places to live on the UK, it usually comes fairly near the top. It's not without its pockets of crime and disorder and associated problems, but it's a relatively safe place. Back in the mid-1990s, myself and two of my then colleagues, Richard Sparks and Evie Girling, conducted a 2-year study of anxiety and talk about crime in this place. We were just interested in what it meant for people to kind of know how crime featured in the kind of everyday lives and consciousness of people who lived outside of the major cities in relatively affluent places, and how their anxiety and talk about crime was connected or not to the sense of the place in which they lived, and its trajectory and history and likely futures, and to their sense of their place in a wider world of kind of possibility and aspiration and hierarchy. So we spent a couple of years in this town. I lived there at the time. We hung around. We did all that kind of standard ethnography thing of observing and going to meetings and talking to a diverse group of people in this town, sometimes informally, sometimes in focus groups, sometimes in extended interviews, really to try and kind of take the temperature of public feeling around crime and order at that time. What did we find? That people tended to worry about burglary, in particular people coming to Macclesfield from Liverpool and Manchester and taking their stuff. They tended to worry about their cars being vandalised or stolen. They worried about drugs. They worried about youths hanging around in public space and causing disorder. And that their principal demand in respect of all this was more visible policing. And it's worth us remembering that we conducted that research at a time when more visible policing wasn't police orthodoxy. So I have a kind of memory of going to public meetings and people demanding that saying they never see the police and wanted to see more of them, and the superintendent trotting out what was then the kind of standard Home Office line, that generic visible patrolling was a waste of scarce resources and those were better targeted elsewhere. People would generally go away angrier than they were when they came into the room in the first place. Now, the reason for mentioning this now is because 25 years on, the Economic and Social Research Council has funded the original three of us, plus Ben Bradford, to revisit this site and to ask a series of similar questions about what does it mean for people to think about crime and related issues, to think about their own security and insecurity in this place at this moment in time. And what I want to come back to that, we're at the beginning of this study, so I have nothing really to do other than promote it. But I want to come back to that study at the end, but I want to spend the next short period of time, as it were, trying to map out, and this will be pretty broad brush stuff, some of the things that have happened both in the social and political context and the changing landscape of risk and protection in the intervening 20 years that both justifies us going back and requires us to do that study in a rather different way than we might have done so originally. And this really is a story about what happened to the fear of crime. Back then, in the mid-1990s, the original study was conducted against a backdrop of in which questions of crime and policing and punishment were prominent parts of political and public discourse in this country. Crime was taken to be one of those things that won or lost elections. It featured prominently in lots of political talk. It was a kind of ambient political issue, salient in all the concerns that people registered with kind of posters. And indeed, one of the kind of motivators behind the original study was to try and figure out how that kind of ambient discourse about crime and control and punishment and the like kind of permeated and shaped the outlooks and social relations of a town like Macclesfield, which, relatively speaking, was not a kind of high crime location. The other part of that surrounding discourse is the question that interested us, how people worry about, talk about crime, what it does to their everyday consciousness and everyday lives, all took place against a kind of backdrop of something called the fear of crime. Fear of crime at that point in time was, to use the contemporary parlance, a thing. It was a thing in two senses. One, it was a kind of criminological paradigm. People like me kind of gathered round, conducted surveys, tried to kind of figure out what the fear of crime was and what caused it and what might be done about it. And fear of crime was a kind of organising reference inside both the police and government. It was something that policymakers and practitioners worried about and tried to address. And there were, in this context, against the backdrop of that paradigm and that kind of policy perspective, there were various familiar lines of dispute. People used to worry about the relationship of fear of crime either to people's personal experience of victimisation or to their mediated experience of crime, what kind of TV programmes they watched, what newspapers they read, what the kind of conversations they had with their neighbours, and all that kind of stuff. There was a kind of ongoing, lively and occasionally acrimonious debate about whether the fear of crime was rational, by which I think people meant proportionate to people's antecedent levels of risk of being a victim, or irrational, i.e. disproportionate. I never quite understood what proportionality was supposed to mean in that context, but we'll leave that aside. There was a kind of feminist critique of the kind of preoccupation with everyday public violence and the sidelining of private violence. And there was a kind of, again, an ongoing and lively discussion, both among criminologists and among policymakers, about whether you addressed fear of crime indirectly. In other words, if you reduce people's levels of risk, their levels of fear would go down, or directly. In other words, actually you had to attack the causes of fear separately from whether or not you reduce people's levels of risk. Now, in the midst of all this, the kinds of things that we found when we did the original study of Macclesfield were almost entirely unsurprising. So the things that people were telling us in this place were the things that dominated public discourse. Youths hanging around, burglary, drugs, town centre violence, demands for more visible policing, a kind of clamour for CCTV, and at the time CCTV was new. It was the kind of silver bullet that was going to resolve all these problems of local disorder. Street lighting, an ongoing discussion about how you responsibilise people to take more steps in their everyday lives to protect their person and their property. That was the backdrop against which that original study took place. And the aim in the original study was already to try and shift the paradigm of the fear of crime paradigm as it was established at the time, on the assumption that one of the things that crime is and was at the time was a kind of metaphor that enabled people to grasp and understand and talk about and mobilise around unsettling social change. So our hunch was that when people talk about crime, they're not only talking about crime, they're talking about other things at the same time. They're talking about their families, their neighbourhoods, their town, their country, their sense of authority, a whole bunch of other things that kind of organise their sense of the world and how it is and how it's gone wrong and what they'd like to put right in the future. Now, in a sense, we were trying at the attempt to try and stretch the boundaries of that paradigm, which in various ways we thought was problematic. What I think has happened in the intervening period is that paradigm has entirely dissolved and disappeared. And I want to try and explain why I think that's the case. So what has happened to fear? The first thing, or the first set of things to make reference to, is a series of significant changes in the social and political context in which people experience or think about the questions of their security or insecurity in relation to crime. There are four things here. I don't take this to be an exhaustive list. There are four things that strike us to be important parameters of that overall shift. The first of these, which our first speaker already made reference to, is the digital revolution. We conducted that first study before Facebook, before YouTube, before Twitter and the like. So any attempt to kind of now grasp what it means to people to be or feel insecure in their everyday lives, just has to come to terms, seriously come to terms, with the digital revolution and how it may have transformed these issues, both in terms of the generation of new risks in people's everyday lives, in terms of the changing ways in which police and other organisations communicate, whether that communication is engagement we can discuss, but communicate with various publics, how those publics communicate with the police, and importantly, with how, and this remains for us an open question, how risks and anxieties and talk about security now circulates inside a place. So it kind of raises a question. I think the digital revolution raises a question about what place and community actually mean in a context where so much communication takes place in digital form across those boundaries. And we now have to get our head around that. The second thing to mention is the changing patterns and meanings of migration. I think when the original study took place, migration bubbled away at the edges of the political discourse. It didn't feature prominently, if at all, in the discussions we had around these issues. I'm fully anticipating that that won't be the case now. And that's partly because of the way, one, in which migration has just shifted to the centre of political discourse, and also because my guess is that migration now does lots of the symbolic work that crime used to do in the mid-1990s. In other words, it's one of the ways in which people, it's a policy issue that enables people to tell themselves and those around them a story about the place in which we live, what's happening to it, our sense of security in it, what's happening to our jobs, our public services, where we draw the boundaries between insiders and outsiders. Crime has the capacity to do all that kind of stuff. Crime has the capacity to do that stuff in connection with migration, but I think now migration does an awful lot of that kind of work, and that part of what we've got to attend to is how that is filtering into discussions of place and insecurity now. The third and fourth things I want to talk about really kind of hang around this term Middle England. One of the reasons we selected Macclesfield for the original study, and I think part of the logic for going back, is it was meant to stand as an example of a kind of term that was in common parlance at the time, namely the notion of Middle England. And the notion of Middle England it didn't mean people who lived in Birmingham. It didn't just mean people who were middle class. It meant something else sociologically and politically. Sociologically, I think it was a term that was meant to capture a strata of the British population who were doing okay, who were better off than their parents, who had a mortgage, who had a job, who had hopes that their children would do better than they were, who had acquired things in life, but therefore had things, who had a certain amount of prosperity and good fortune, but weren't so secure. But one, that means they had things to defend. But also they weren't so secure that they didn't also worry that it could all be taken away from them. I come from a family in which my mum and my brother both went bankrupt in the early mid-1990s. They were examples of exactly that phenomenon, of doing well and fearing that it could all be taken away at a stroke for reasons that weren't to do with your own decisions. And in a sense, Middle England was meant to capture that uneasy combination of success and anxiety. And studying Macclesfield was meant to kind of get at that question and how crime featured in the lives and consciousness of people who are in that situation. One of the things that I think has happened in the intervening period is that term has disappeared from the sociological lexicon because the phenomenon it is meant to describe has been radically transformed and replaced by a whole series of new social and political and cultural divisions. Some of those are between generations, between baby boomers and between millennials. Some of those, and this overlaps with the generational question, are between people who own their own home and people who have no prospect of owning their own home. I'm very conscious that I've become for a generation who are likely, many people in this room I expect are in the same position, where there's a serious possibility that our children will not do as well economically as we have done. We live in a world where actually the aspiration to own a home now seems so remote to many people in their 20s and 30s that they just rule it out as a reasonable aspiration for their life. That has radically upset what Middle England meant to capture. There are other kinds of divisions between the economically secure and the just about managing. And there are those partly economic and partly cultural divides between those that David Goodhart rather polemically called anywheres and somewheres. In other words, people who are kind of rooted in a place, don't live not very far from where they're born, have most of their family and friends around them, have all kinds of attachments to things called community and loyalty and family, and those people who are unrooted in place, who think about the world in more borderless and cosmopolitan terms. Of course, onto that division, you can now place a division between leavers and remainers, which have become in our culture and our politics not simply ways of thinking about what you think about Britain's membership of the EU, but kind of placeholders for a whole series of other kinds of cultural and political aspirations. Now, of course, this relates to the other way in which the term Middle England has disappeared. Middle England politically was meant to describe those categories of people that the main parties had to appeal to in an election in order to generate a coalition of support that enabled them to win. The importance of that for people who think about crime and fear of crime was that crime became one of the policy areas around which that coalition of support was generated. Anyone who's paying even the slightest bit of attention to the current general election will notice that the terms of political debate have changed somewhat. There has been an evacuation of the political centre. There is no sense that trying to generate a coalition to appeal to the median unfloating voter, what used to be called Mondeo man, or Worcester woman, has entirely disappeared. So part of the changing political landscape with which we now investigate questions of crime and insecurity has something to do with that. Right. A bit more local to home. We need also to think about questions of security and insecurity in the context of the changing coordinates of risk and protection. Much of this will be very familiar to those in you in the room. I shall briefly skate over it. Again, it is not meant to be exhaustive, but to indicate some of the important things that have changed. First, changing patterns of volume crime, not least around questions of burglary and car crime, which has both reduced the kind of daily level of risk that many people face in relation to these threats, but has also taken some of the political heat out of those considerations. Now, that's not to say that those issues have entirely either gone away, either in people's lives or in the ways in which various agencies respond to them. There has been a resurface and reshaping of some of them around questions to do with county lines drugs or knife crime and so on and so forth. But the general kind of the pattern of risk and the attendant level of political attention and mobilisation about that risk does seem to many of us who study these things to have transformed significantly in the intervening 25 years. There has, in relation to that, been the emergence of a whole series of what you might describe as more remote and placeless risks, by which I mean risks that seem kind of real, but no one's quite sure, one, where they come from, where they're happening, and whether or not they're ever going to happen in the place in which I happen to be now living. So you can cite here the emergence of Islamic and far-right terrorism, various kinds of criminal activity generated by the digital revolution around cybercrime, the proliferation of things like ongoing hate, the proliferation of activity and worry and policy responses around grooming and childhood sex exploitation. That's a whole bunch of stuff. We can say very particular things about each of them, but they seem to have in common that notion of kind of remoteness and placeless. They're part of our world, but we don't really know how exactly to situate them or think about them as threats to our daily existence. And then I'm really going to skate over this very quickly because of the audience, an altered set of protective priorities. So the intervening 25 years have seen a bucket of money thrown at the police and a bucket of money withdrawn from the police. We've seen the rise, if you take my starting point of that public meeting where people were told that visible policing was a waste of public money, the rise and fall of neighbourhood policing as a central policing activity, a much more complex governance of private space, and I think importantly, the rise of kind of safeguarding and protecting the vulnerable. In other words, a shift of policing priorities towards high and hidden harm, things that call for different kinds of skills, have a different kind of relationship to the public, because much of that kind of police activity is invisible, and generates its own challenges in terms of both doing it well and effectively and sustaining public trust and legitimacy for those things. So, against that backdrop, the original three of us and Ben are returning to Macclesfield. And the project we have in mind is an attempt now to try and understand everyday insecurity, what it means for people to be and feel secure in the place in which they live. When I say we there, meaning a whole range of diverse publics who occupy this town, against the backdrop of both that shifting social and political context and that shifting landscape of risk and protection. So our question now is about that. It's about trying to understand people's capacity to be and feel secure or not in relation to their everyday routines and environment. It requires, we think, a different set of conceptual resources. I'm kind of conscious this is being recorded, but I think I can still say that I always thought fear was a dodgy analytical category and best done away with and put in the dustbin of history. I think it makes much more sense conceptually to think of the question that we're interested in as one of security and insecurity in people's everyday lives. We can bring to that subject a bunch of studies in anthropology, in security studies that can help us inform in a very different context what that looks and feels like. And I think this project does have to involve a sustained engagement with digital social science and its concepts and its methods. Methodologically, we're doing many of the same things that we did last time round. We're hanging around the streets, we're going to meetings, we'll be talking to people in focus groups, but we'll also be doing a survey, hence why Ben is involved. We'll also be doing some sustained kind of analysis of online communication. But importantly for us, and this kind of relates to the theme of today, that we think of this project not as us simply kind of turning up as external researchers, finding out what we need to know and disappearing again and writing a book. But we think of this as an exercise, the whole project, as an exercise in kind of deliberative inquiry. In other words, in trying to do what we can with the resources that we have to foster, either in naturally occurring spaces or in spaces that we actually create and bring people together, to foster a conversation about risk and insecurity and what it means for people to live in this place and either feel secure or insecure at this particular point in time. And that does, I think, relate to the substantive theme of this conference. Not only the nuts and bolts of how do you, as police or anyone engaged in this field, engage different publics, but also because it reminds me of a very important insight into what it means for people to be secure. I think involving people in an ongoing conversation about their own security is itself a contribution to that security. In other words, part of being involved in a routine encounter can provide resources that can make people feel secure. Now, we can't do that in the context of a single research project, but we can do something that both can provide material and, we hope, kind of conceptual tools for thinking about how agencies who engage in this task on a daily basis might go about that issue, task in a better and more effective way. Thank you very much.